So the wiring here is pretty much all set. As you can see, all these colorful wires here running to the back. That's for the fuse box, goes all the way to the back. This side is done. We just have to do the other side now. And we're going to take a break from wiring and try installing these gauges here. So the harness here, one side goes to the sensor and the other side goes to the gauge itself. It goes there. The other harness goes to the power. So that is pretty much set for the first one, which will go on one side here. We'll probably put it after the O2 sensor. That'll go here. I'll plug that later. There, then we have that's our boost gauge. That's our vacuum. That goes all the way back here for a vacuum port. So we have two more gauges. One is going to be the water coolant temperature. So we have the AFR ratio gauge, we have the boost gauge, I have the coolant temperature gauge, and I have one more that's coming in, which is the oil pressure gauge. And that's pretty much everything we need for now. Pretty much along on the side here, we'll have to reroute them properly, but the whole idea is it will be right here. Alright, so it's currently the next day. I went and picked up some packages. Alright, so we have the oil pressure in, the gauge for the oil pressure. We have some adapters that we're going to have to use for the fuel pump. I'm going to have to modify the fuel pump to adapt the return line to it. So I'm going to tap it and insert an AN fitting to it. So that's there. We have this adapter here for the fuel rail. So we can install an AN fitting on the 2JZ stock fuel rail. So that's cool as well. We have some heat shrink wraps for the wirings. Some more AN fittings for the fuel rail. We have two posts for the I'm gonna mount these at the front. So I have since the battery is in the trunk now, I'm gonna have two posts at the front in case I need to, you know, do a junction or give it a boost. I could use these as boost terminals. So the way you want to do is, you know, every gauge has its own instructions with the wiring, but I tapped them from the panel over here, the fuse box panel here. So there's one line that's switched 12 volts and there's one line that's constant, and we're going to tap them in the appropriate lines, and once I turn the ignition on, all these gauges should turn on. Now I do have 4 gauges in total. One is oil pressure, coolant temperature, AFR gauge, and boost gauge. So we have 4, and I'm thinking of getting a 5th gauge, which would be for the fuel pressure. Even though I have a gauge here, but I would still like to know what's happening from inside, because really this is just an adjuster. So I don't know, might get a gauge for the fuel pressure. So I'm not in a hurry for that now, but let's connect this guy and turn it on. I'm just temporarily mounting this for now. As you can see, I'm still not done wrapping up the wires. I am done on the other side, but I'm not going to wrap up here because I might actually pull the ECU to the back as well for the JZ. So I'm still not 100% confirmed. Plus, I want to run the vehicle, make sure everything is good before I wrap this side up. And yeah, so for now I'm just gonna tape them, and hopefully everything goes well. That's pretty cool. I like how it looks. Okay, so the gauges are done. I'm just wiring up the wires to the ECU for the JZ. Now for the time being, I'm going to leave the 2JZ ECU somewhere around here. I'm not going to move it to the back until I confirm everything is good, because I don't want to really cut any wires and then have to chase down things if things don't go well. So I'm going to leave that for here. We have space anyways here. Doesn't look the greatest, but I'll make sure it looks nice at least. And now for the wiring, it's pretty simple actually. You'll just need about, I would say, I don't know how many exactly, but maybe 5 or 6 that get powered. For the crank, basically for the crank signal, what outputs the crank signal from the RX8 is the main harness here. So if you look at the fuse box, you'll see this big plug over here in the corner. The white and blue is what's responsible for giving the engine the crank signal, giving the starter the crank signal. So I tapped that into the 2JZ crank signal. So now when I go and crank my RX8, instead of telling the RX8 starter, it's going to tell the 2J starter to go ahead. So we got that going. Now for the alternator, there are 2 wires. So what you're going to have to do is basically just trace, like, first of all, you can print these out online, okay, just wiring harness for the 2JZ. There are 2 wires coming out that's responsible for the alternator. One is red and blue, that needs 12 volts ignition on. Now when I say ignition on, is when you turn the ignition on, that's when you get 12 volts, not constant. There's another here wire that's white and blue, that's connected via 5 amp fuse, constant power, so constant 12 volts whether the ignition is off, on, anything. So I have that running all the way to the back, connected to a 5 amp fuse. And now for, just because I'm going through the diagrams again, so for example here it says power to coils and igniter, BF26, the plug looks like this. So now for the other wires that we need power, which is for pretty much the fuel injectors, for the coils and igniter, and all these stuff that we're going to go through. So the power to coils and igniter is located in plug BF2, which is this guy here, and it's pin number 6, which will be this guy. So that is coil igniter. Okay, that's there. Now if you look at the main ECU, there's 5 plugs or 6 depending on what type of ECU you have. I have the one without the immobilizer. That's B1, B2, B3, F59, F60, and on the side here you'll find the plug. So it's pretty easy. You could just look at the plug style. Now the other plugs they're talking about here is actually the harness plug, which is this guy here. It comes part of the 2J. If you didn't get it, then you're gonna have to do some more tracing. But typically they sell it just like that. They cut the wires and give you the whole thing together. But anyways, they're looking at, if we look at BF2, so 2 up, 2 down, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we look at the plug that has, I think it's this guy here. So we get this guy, I believe. If we look at it like that, let me get this paper here for a second. So if we get the paper here and we look at the plug, pretty much matches it. and now we need number 6. So number 6 is the second one from the bottom left, which is a black and white. Now just to confirm before you start, you know, just going by colors, because there's a lot of times that colors are going to match but they're different. So just to be on the safe side, get yourself a multimeter. I have a couple of them around here in the garage, and use the continuity function on your multimeter. So what that does is basically it does a continuity and it beeps once it connects the two wires together. So now if I go in continuity and if I just connect these two wires, okay, got the wrong settings here. Go again. So that's the beep style. So if I touch these two wires, it's gonna beep. So basically what this is doing is it's just telling you if this line and this line is connected. It's gonna beep if it does. Now we need to know which wire is located towards this plug. So we start probing every wire that we have exposed, and the one that's gonna beep is the one that we need. Actually, I'm doing it wrong because this plug connects to that plug and then has pins outside. So what I need to do is tap it from the back. I'm gonna put that back in there to continue the continuity of the wire, and I'm gonna probe it from the back, and then start touching wires. Okay, let's do this. Also, what you could do, actually, my multimeter has this function where it pinches the wire. So I'm gonna go the wire that I need, which is this guy here, which is that guy there. I'm gonna pinch it, and then I'm gonna touch the other. Oh, so you see how that beeps? That tells me this wire goes all the way to this exposed wire. So now this wire, according to the table we have here, tells us that this wire is responsible for power to coil and igniter. So now we read the description. The body side, the body loom side, which is this whole mess here, needs to be connected to battery voltage via the ignition switch when the ignition is in the run and crank positions to switch battery voltage to the coils and igniter. The engine loom side of this pin connects to the coil and igniter power supply pins. So now we know this power here is for the coil and igniter. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna, thing is, I don't want to solder all the wires to the JZ computer here, because if I have to remove the engine, that means I have to desolder every single wire. So what I'm doing is I'm actually using these quick, or not even quick, they're just regular connectors, wire connectors. So I'm gonna get the box here, find appropriate size. I think this should be good enough. Okay, let's try this guy out. Okay, well, that would go in there. Problem is I don't trust this. Well, I guess that would do it for now. And then grab our crimper. You could even use a plier to do it, but since I have this little crimpy tool, we could use that to crimp our connectors. Make sure it's there good. And now we're going to try to find a source for that wire, which is 12 volts in ignition on and the crank position, according to what they need here. So it needs to be connected to battery voltage via the ignition switch when the ignition is in the run and crank position. So what you could really do is, since I have this accessible here, I could see which wires have voltage, or I could tap in one of these lines just like how I did for the gauges and the crank signal and everything else. But yeah, pretty much I'm gonna trace the source for it, and then we'll move on to the next wire. All right, so here there's a couple wires that need power and crank and run. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to find one wire, bring it to the front, and then I'll split it here to whatever it needs. As to the ones where they need fuses, I'll run that straight all the way to the back. And yeah, the other ones don't really need fuses. They just need power and run and crank position. So I'll find a wire that gets 12 volts when it's in run position and crank position. I'll bring that wire to the front, and then I'll split it to whatever wire is needed for that. Other than that, everything again is straightforward. Just read the description, read what pin it is, and just connect it to your vehicle. And yeah, we should have this thing fired up really soon. Anyways, I know you guys hate wiring, so I'm just gonna do everything right now, and we will get back once I wire this up. Alright, so we got the whole fuel pump situation sorted out. After I figured that broken pin, we repaired that. I was still not getting the ECU to turn on my fuel pump or ground it. And that's because when we removed the air pump, there's actually a fuel pump resistor right here that needs to be connected. If this is not connected, the ECU will not ground the fuel pump. So make sure whenever you're removing the air pump, like how I did this, the fuel pump resistor is actually mounted under the air pump. So if I look at the air pump here, it was at the bottom here. And yeah, anyways, I plugged that in. Now the ECU primes, but it still doesn't, you know, continuously run once I crank. At this point, it could be just a sensor that needs to be connected for the ECU to know that the engine is on. So what I'm going to do right now, we're going to try to pinpoint which wire goes to the harness. That way we can chop it off and connect it in our ECU, extend the wire all the way down here, and then bolt it onto the bracket and face it on the crank pulley. That way we get the RPMs working. As for the speed, I believe it all works from the ABS and the speed sensors, so not too worried about that. Alright, so I do have a harness that I cut off from another RX8, and what I need to do right now is figure out which connector goes to the crank sensor. So what I'm going to do over here is the following. I'm going to get a multimeter, disconnect the crank sensor. So now that we have this one disconnected, you could either try tracing it by the color. So here we have one yellow and orange, and the other one is yellow black. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my multimeter to the continuity test, put it on a beep. That way when I connect the wires, it beeps. So what I need to do is basically one side will go in here in one of the pins that we're trying to find out. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to start probing every yellow and red that I see. Alright, so we found it here. So looking at it this way, it's this guy here. So it's a second connector. Alright, so that's the second connector here. And the one there is looking at the pin that way. It's a third one on the top. Okay. And let's go to the one beside it, which is yellow and black. Okay. So it's the two same connectors that's side by side. The ones here. So these two here. So we have this connector here, which as you can see is the exact same line. So all I'm going to do is extend it. This side goes in the sensor itself. And then we'll extend the wire here. So I see a shielded wire that's going around. I'm not sure if that needs to be replicated in the wire that I'm going to extend. But I'm trying to see if it just looms around the wires or actually connects to something. I think that might be like a shield wire or something. Maybe a signal. I'm really not sure. Alright, so now that we have this disconnected, we know what to connect to it. I'm going to connect this all the way at the back in the ECU. So this connector goes here. That connector goes there. Now I'm going to get two wires, extend them all the way to the front and into the crank position sensor. That way we can mount it on the 2J and hopefully have everything working out good. So what you're going to do is you're going to actually take off the plate from your RX8. This is what the crank sensor reads. We're going to mount this on the adapter plate, and then we will mount the sensor like that to pick up the tooth rings, and we'll have the RPMs working. So for now I'm just going to extend the wires, and then we'll get back to the next thing we'll work on. Okay, so the original adapter here comes with the pre-drilled hole from the front. That way the crank sensor faces the pulley, but that's meant to be using with the stock dampener, and this is an aftermarket light pulley, so I had to re-drill them on the side here. That way it picks it up from the side. It could work either or, from the front or from the side. So I think that should be fine, and that is mainly for our RPMs. Because like I said before, the speed works based on the wheel sensors, but that crank signal gets the RPM, the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000s. And also if that is not connected, the car will know that the engine is not running, so we'll stop the fuel pump. So once that picks up the signal, everything is good to go.